Hello and welcome to Stark Talk here on BBC Radio Scotland. I'm Edi Stark, here in Glasgow to talk to an award-winning, much-lauded Scottish author for whom smart lawyers, gritty detectives and suffering anti-heroes hold no appeal. Although he does write with authority about messed-up adults. Born in 1968, his artistic interest is primarily in his own generation, the post-baby boomers, often called the Me generation or Generation X, who grew up with MTV and pricey trainers, only to discover as adults that they'd be hard pushed to find job security and stable lifelong relationships. And indeed, an older, less liberal generation of readers might struggle with some of the subject matter. So be warned, swinging, a lifestyle choice with multiple sex partners, will be alluded to at some time in the programme. Here is a serious, if often hilarious writer, unsparing in social realism, brave, honest and frank about what it is to cope with modern life and relationships when it sometimes seems there's nothing to believe in anymore.
I think that's spot on, Edie. Absolutely. The whole Generation X thing and the baby boomers. I find myself, it's very hard to communicate to baby boomers because they tend to believe in stuff, which my generation don't.
I'm a baby boomer.
I know, I'm sure we'll get on fine though.
Ewan Morrison, I've been wondering about how to structure this interview to fit in your work and aspects of your life. Let me list them. An unusual childhood with hippie alternative parents in Wick, being a gifted artist, a successful filmmaker, moving to the States and then losing everything, job, home and marriage, choosing a year in perverse, as you've called it, as an active and willing participant in Glasgow's swinging scene, finding love at the other side of the world and conducting a long-distance relationship, being a hands-on dad living alone, finding success and emotional expression as a writer, and now living what looks like a Mills and Boon happy ever after, although there is no such thing in any of your books. So what I've decided to do, Ewan Morrison, and it might be a bit crass and lumpen, but I'm going to use your novels as a basis for telling your life. Authors can be a bit snippy about being asked if their work is autobiographical, but it does seem to me that with great courage you do take your own life and the lives of other people that you know and life events and you mix and model and tinker with them to make beautiful narratives. So are you up for this?
Yeah, sure. And also I think I do, when I'm in the middle of a life experience, I catch myself thinking, ooh, this would be a good book. So I do tend to push myself further out as well. So it's a reciprocal thing. I don't just take my life and turn it into books. I also live more extremely, I suppose, because I think it might be good to write about. Before
your first novel, which was your second book, you had written a book of short stories called The Last Book You Read. It got you dubbed a Scottish purveyor of erudite filth.
Yes. Yeah, that was unusual because I didn't think it was either filthy or erudite. But at the time, you have to remember, I was living in complete poverty as a newly divorced man. The roof had just fallen in the house I was in, and people were calling me the Scottish purveyor of erudite filth, and I was up for Arena Man of the Year award, and they used that title. It was them that actually coined it. So I found myself sort of propelled into this weirdly successful world. I didn't fit the bill at all.
Well, apart from the short stories and film scripts and the most recent Tales from the Mall, which is a mix of sociology and oral history and fiction, you have created 4 novels. Swung, published in 2007, Distance, published in 2008, Ménage in 2009 and Close Your Eyes in 2012. So let's start with Close Your Eyes, which draws from much of your own childhood.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the book and then we can talk about you.
Well, the book's really, it's about someone who had a very extreme childhood growing up in an experimental hippie commune. It was something I didn't myself experience, but my parents were hippies living in the far north, among a lot of escapees, if you like, in the 60s from the modern world who headed up there into the remote.
To Wick?
Well, yeah, Wick might not have been the best choice. A lot of other people made it to Orkney and the other islands. Up in near Inverness, there was the Findhorn Foundation, which my parents were never part of, but I tried to imagine in the book what it would have been like had I grown up somewhere like the Findhorn Foundation. And I decided, therefore, to go undercover and spend a week in Findhorn on what's called their Experience Week.
And call it research.
And call it research, yeah. It was extremely hard to do, actually, because at the time I was a smoker and a drinker and an eater of chocolate and meat. None of these things were allowed in this New Age community.
Did you hug trees?
I hugged trees, I hugged the ground. I was amazed at how they'd managed to do things like sell weekend workshops in looking at a river or discovering your inner dolphin for $1,000 a pop. But
so you were a cynic about it then?
I was a cynic, but really the journey in the story is about a cynic who is a heartbroken cynic, a woman who watched the failure of a great ideal collapse around her when she was a child and who suffered horribly as a result of her parents' idealism collapsing.
Which I think perhaps you know a little bit about yourself.
Sure.
But the character that struck me as possibly being most like you as a child is Jono, who suffered from a dreadful stammer, as indeed you did.
I did.
I found it painful to read because it seemed so realistic.
Well, I guess there's maybe little things that I do in the book where I don't write from the perspective of the stutterer, but I express the pain people experience witnessing. His hands are moving about erratically, his eyeballs are rolling up to the sky, he's gasping for breath. These are all things that I experienced myself.
Do you know why?
With me, I think it started out with local kids teasing me because they thought I was English, because I didn't have the local accent. In Caithness, she would say, "A dog's sitting in a garden," you know, the dog sitting in the garden. And if I say the dog sitting in the garden, then I just sound like a posh Englisher to folk who live up there. But I had an incapacitating stutter to the point where I couldn't say my own name from the age of about 9 to 13.
That's a huge part of your childhood.
It really is pretty arduous and really leaves its mark. There was a lot of physical abuse that came with that. I mean, who's going to beat up a stuttering kid?
What sort of form did the abuse take? Because it's pretty horrendous for poor old Jono.
Well, I was systematically bullied for about 3 or 4 years, to the point where I gave in and just accepted that it would be a daily phenomena. The toughest kid in the school had steel toe-capped brogues, and one of the rituals was kicking people in the head with the steel toe-capped brogues.
You've been kicked in the head?
Yeah. Made to eat dirt, stripped. I think the worst I remember was being told to stand against a wall in a bike shed, to hold my mouth open while 3 or 4 boys at the other side of the bike shed took turns spitting, long distance spitting. Very hilarious for them to try to hit the bullseye, you know, and then I was vomiting. Extreme stuff. I was known as, you know, Poof was the thing. You know, my parents didn't even know that I was just referred to, you know, as Poofy Ewan for about 4 years.
Have you seen them as adults?
I have, yeah. I've had my revenge on the bullies by going back to the town and looking at what wretched little nobodies they've become. I remember going back and watching one of them, fat now, and in his little bourgeois bungalow, as my dad would have said, feeding the rabbits while his brat kids hit him with plastic swords and his wife moaned at him. I just thought, you pathetic person who amounted to nothing. You thought you were so important. But then again, that's just me being cruel about normal people. But I used to just long for the day where Dunray would blow up. You know, this was the nuclear power station. It was my popular fantasy, and I prepared a nuclear bunker in my own house so that we could survive, and had discussions with my mum and dad, who were really into the idea that their son was getting into CND in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. But, you know, I joke about that, but it was one of my wishes, was that the entire community would be destroyed by a nuclear blast. I would walk about the cliff tops thinking that quite regularly. Completely mad.
Was there anybody that you could talk to about it, though? Like your parents?
Remember, I had a stutter as well, and I was having to hide a lot of stuff that was going on at school from my parents, because well-meaning hippies are not the best people to go knocking on people's door and saying, you know, you're beating up my son. You know, standing there with their long hair and their hippie sandals and their scrawny jeans. I know now that a lot of the animosity towards me as a kid was actually just hatred of my parents by the locals.
Did you hate your parents?
I only latterly have had to deal with severe anger and rage against my parents and what I thought was irresponsible in my 30s, in my 40s.
At the time you were, as a kid, you won some sort of plasticine model making competition, one of your first awards.
Well, there you go. I think I was 15 or something. What does a kid who has a stutter and who is bullied do? Well, what I did was I discovered I could make lifelike plasticine model figures with incredible detail. I look back on it and I think actually what I was doing was I was populating a society that I was the master of.
Well, you're still doing that.
The God and Master.
As a writer.
I suppose so. But I would literally, on a bad day when I felt sorry for myself, I would crush a plasticine model and effectively kill someone. However, I was a runner-up in the British plasticine model competition.
So that was your Blue Peter badge.
That was my Blue Peter badge. The John O'Groat Journal said Plasticine King of Scotland.
Oh, did that stop the bullying?
What did stop the bullying, I think, was puberty. Everyone else feeling awkward about themselves. And I guess the self-confidence that came with artistic practice, because kids learned that I was really good at art, really good at drawing, really good at model making. And if they hung out with me, they could skive off their normal classes and hang out in the art class.
Your parents had gone up to Wick, wanting to live an alternative lifestyle.
Yeah.
Your dad was a librarian. Your parents ran a festival up in Wick.
The Festival of Poetry, Folk and Jazz.
But as a child, you saw their values collapse to pretty catastrophic effect.
They brought a lot of Scotland's great poets to hang out in our house, basically.
Norman McCaig, Ian Crichton-Smith.
Norman McCaig and Ian Crichton-Smith. There's a photograph somewhere of me sticking a Tonka toy into Fionn McCullough's ear. So it was part of this sort of great modernist idea of bringing culture to the masses.
And enriching your life.
And enriching my life. Yeah, but at the same time, there was the W. Gordon Smith play that my dad had brought up there, and it was a world premiere, and about 15 people turned up. And my father hit the bottle when he realised the festival wouldn't work. But, it was this big 60s dream, one which ruined our family economics.
So dreadful for you. Here you have these parents with great intentions. You're being bullied savagely at school.
Yeah.
And your dad is fast becoming an alcoholic.
Yeah.
So much for being a flower child.
And my story is exactly the same as the stories of flower children all over the world. I think we live with this subconscious hatred that our parents had of the normal world. But we had to fit in a way that they didn't.
They were trying to create, though, an unpolluted world for you, though.
They meant well. Born in 68, we were the children of the revolution. But we grew up watching their revolution fail, and watching your parents fail is pretty crushing.
You do tend to write about people who have broken away from convention and or what's seen as normal. Let's move on to another book.
Yep.
Your third novel, I'm not doing this in order, Ménage, is set in the 90s. It's about 3 bohemian artists living in a love triangle. Again, there are hints of your own life because you left school in Wick and went to Glasgow School of Art.
Yep.
Did you fit in any better there?
Not to start with, but yeah, eventually, because art school is a wonderful place for freaks, and we managed to socialise ourselves finally.
Were you a good artist?
People seem to think so, although I was very impatient. I think the first 10 years of my creative activity were very butterfly. I would move from one thing to the next.
But good at everything.
Yeah, but then I would lose faith. I'd have this crisis of faith. I could have stuck at any of the things that I started, being a portrait painter, which is a bit odd now that I look back at it, then being a photographer, and then being a maker of installations and making arts documentaries and being a critic.
You went to Goldsmiths, though, didn't you?
I went to Goldsmiths for a semester.
Ménage looks at this love triangle that I mentioned earlier, a relationship between Dorothy, who's a student at Goldsmiths, and her flatmates Saul and Owen. Are you like any of those characters?
Interestingly, I'm like all 3 of them. I even made the artwork that goes in the book as well. Well, she's like a rich kid, a bit of a space cadet, but she's got this kind of very easy, spontaneous way with making art that comes naturally to her. Owen's the kind of try-hard, political, philosophical person who's never really satisfied with anything, and he's a bit of a follower. He's not a leader. And Saul is this kind of Oscar Wildean nihilist. He's a tragicomic figure. He speaks in nothing but aphorisms all the time.
He's a hoot.
He's also a kind of a dangerous person, but he's like the kind of engine and motivating force behind this little. You know, there's a thing in clinical studies of madness, a folie à deux. Well, this is a folie à trois. There's three of them together in their own self-contained little world. They make art really by documenting their own lives, and it starts off really banal, like let's dress up like the Velvet Underground and Nico, or let's film ourselves eating pot noodle, and then it ends up becoming let's film ourselves slapping each other, let's film ourselves having sex together. The art becomes bigger, it becomes more important, but at the same time they're on the verge of destroying themselves too.
You're poking fun at Brit art in many ways, but were you part of that scene yourself? Would you have been creating work a little like that?
One of the pieces in the book was my actual graduation piece where I slapped about a good friend of mine. He's now a really successful artist living in Finland by the name of Charles Sanderson, and he sat still for an hour while I slapped him and my friends kissed him, and that became a portrait.
So you are Dorothy Shears.
I was Dorothy Shears, yeah.
Were you in a love triangle?
Was I in a love triangle? Kind of, and not entirely. I've certainly been in a situation in which there were three artists who were making art together and preying off their own confusing interrelationships, but it never got as explicit or as intense as it did in the book.
Did you live in a flat as grotty as theirs?
I did. In fact, even worse. Even worse. The spare room full of bin bags used food and rubbish. That was a reality. We were really pushing the package as students at Glasgow School of Art. I think it was because there was a lot of really scary performance art at the time by people like Stuart Brisley and stuff. He would sit in a bath full of decaying meat and breathe through a straw. So we thought, well, if he's a tutor here, well, then why should we take the bins out?
Yeah.
Oh, it was very bohemian, the whole thing.
You're listening to Stark Talk here on BBC Radio Scotland. I'm Edi Stark, and my guest is the author, Ewan Morrison. Ewan, I've plundered two of your novels so far to kind of give a bit of licence to be very nosy about your life. So let's move to distance now. Tom and Meg desperately cling on to a transatlantic relationship. Neither of them are particularly likeable.
No. Well, that's okay, isn't it?
Yeah. Compelling, but not necessarily likeable. Tom is unstable, volatile, suicidal, needy, feels inadequate. He's an alcoholic. Pretty familiar territory then.
Well, I always think that all my characters are sort of a bit of me, but pushed to limits. So there is part of me that is all those things, or was all those things, or is still working through all those things. And it was a hard book to write because I'd had the success of the first book, and you got to come out with your second one. And I probably made the mistake of digging as darkly as I could into the rot at the heart of myself for that book. And as you say, pulled out some pretty unlikable characters.
What was your own experience of being in New York, though? You went there very much as the successful, multi-award-winning, BAFTA-nominated filmmaker. You'd been at umpteen festivals abroad. Everything was going your way. And you'd gone there with your wife. You had 2 children.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And everything just went from under you, didn't it? You lost your job?
I lost my job. I went nuts, I think. I think I'd so much resting on this thing of wanting to make this film in America to show that I could stand on my own 2 feet, put all my past behind me, almost like starting again in another world. When that fell through and I felt I was back in Scotland, I was stuck back in this sort of place that I'd so desperately wanted to escape from.
What went wrong for you?
The company went wrong. The company didn't manage to live to the end of its plans. But this is just part of American capitalism, really. Capitalism, venture capitalism. Some things go right, some things go wrong. So when that failed, I did crack up. I had a breakdown.
How did you know you were having a breakdown? People use the word breakdown without really knowing what it means.
My breakdown was alcohol-induced cracking up. Dangerous behaviours, which could have killed me.
Awful for your wife, then.
Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Terrifying as well. I really wanted to just not exist anymore. I was very angry and I didn't know what to do. And thankfully, from that incredible depression, I started writing for myself.
We started this section of our conversation talking about distance. Meg lives in America. Tom lives in Edinburgh. You met your wife, Emily Ballou, at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2006, when you were awarded a residency in Varuna in Australia. She had never heard of you. She was a successful screenwriter and poet and novelist. And when I asked her what her first impressions of you were, she said, full on, intense, and it came on very strong. She said that your first line to her was, "Can you get me out of here? I need wine, loud music, cigarettes and space." And I thought, where have I read that before? And of course it's in Distance.
There you go. Well, I did actually steal quite a bit from my real life for Distance.
The truth is that, in fact, yours is rather a wonderful love story. A successful one.
Well, that's funny, because I remember when I was writing the book, it's got about 3 different endings. There's one ending that it's a happy ending in the book. And I thought, not only is that kind of corny and against the way that I do things, but I thought, what would happen if I ended up with a happy ending in the book and it didn't go well for me and Emily? And I was a bit superstitious, maybe. So I went for the really horrible ending in the book. It is a horrible ending. It's just dreadful. It's the worst possible. And that somehow managed to bring about Emily actually deciding to move to this country.
She said that it was really make or break, that, you know, you'd conducted this relationship for 2 years and you spoke on the phone for 2 hours every day.
Yeah.
It either had to finish or she had to bite the bullet and come over, because you had this great sense of responsibility to your own children.
Yeah. Well, she's been a great stepmother. That's the thing. She walked straight into our lives with such sort of exuberance, and my daughter took to her straight away. In fact, I'd had some girlfriends previously that I'd never really wanted to introduce anyone to my kids. It was a bit of a taboo thing. I think most men who've been divorced as part of a breakdown, I certainly never felt I could ever be in a meaningful relationship again. I thought I would always be sort of damaged goods and I'd failed and just count my losses on that. I never really bargained for getting a second shot.
Is this redemptive love?
Very much so, and compassionate as well, understanding. In fact, I think it's a kind of better love, the love that you get once you've failed a few times.
You've married twice. What made you do something so conventional?
I really don't buy into any of the hippie stuff anymore. I've said goodbye to all of this stuff. This is your rebellion. This is my rebellion. I would love to be as square as possible these days. I don't see anything radical in not getting married.
Well, that brings us on to the novel Swung. One of the main characters, David, is described as impotent in so many ways. And his partner, Alice, who's also trying to find some sort of fulfillment in her life. She's a failed artist.
And she's American as well.
And she's
that
American.
Was, interestingly, before I met Emily.
So they make this lifestyle choice of sex with multiple partners in order to kind of make themselves feel better about the world. And you had made exactly the same choice. Did you do it for fun?
I did it because it was a possibility. I think it was facilitated in many ways by the internet as well. It's now become really very popular. It was a bit of a minority pursuit at the time. But I was just really curious. I remember thinking maybe a lot of the conflicts that couples have are just to do with this ownership thing, you know?
Did you have a regular partner as a couple?
I had one partner that I swung with mostly, yeah.
Have you no interest in that now?
None whatsoever.
Are you really monogamous?
I'm really monogamous. But I think it's because my life's moved on in so many different ways.
And you were troubled.
Yeah, no, I think most people who are involved in swinging are troubled.
Because for me, it was a book which full of salacious detail.
Yeah.
But, I have to say, pretty unsexy.
There's not much in the way of real gratification in there, yeah. Swinging has...
I would have thought it was the very thing that would have given you performance anxiety.
Well, there's certainly plenty of... There's tons of that goes on within swinging as well. I guess it demystifies the ritual. What I liked about the swinging thing was it did cross... It sounds utopian, but it did cross all these cultural boundaries and class boundaries. It's like a great little hidden society, if you like, of people whose values change and are fluid and are... I make it sound much better than it really is.
So, in 2006... when you meet your future wife, Emily, Swung is still in draft form, and you give it to her to read. What is her response?
Well, I wouldn't want to go too much into her own sexual past as well, but just I guess.
She was a lesbian for 10 years.
She was, yes, and so she wasn't really afraid of the content in that way. You know, if anything, I think she might have thought it was too bourgeois and heterosexual, because it's about a straight couple.
What she told me was that she felt that, well, at least he's got all that stuff behind him. It's all history.
It'd probably be good for most women to know that about their partners as well, because most women live in terror of infidelity and all the rest of it.
Does she not miss having female partners?
I don't know, you'd have to ask her.
I have. She says that you're actually quite feminine, and the women that she went for before were pretty boyish.
She also says that men who are good at parking make better lovers. So I don't know where we go with that.
Are you a good parker?
I'm very good at, apparently. I can park on a dime, apparently.
You're now in your mid-40s, a classic time for midlife crisis. But it sounds to me like you've actually done with crises.
I did mine already, yes.
So how successful do you think you now are in adapting to a normal world, a world that your parents wanted to reject? You've struggled to adapt to it, haven't you? Because you didn't have a normal childhood.
It is very hard to accept the world as it is and accept that I have a place within it and that maybe people even like or appreciate me is very, very hard to accept. In fact, I find it so hard that in the last few years I've given up alcohol and put myself in therapy because I have to grapple with my belonging in the normal world. I find it upsetting that I'm here and I'm doing well.
You see, the thing is, Ewan, it's a bit of a mind shift for you to go from being the kid that everybody looked down to being the adult that many people look up to. That's a big journey.
I would like to be less complicated, though, at times, because I do tend to sort of think excessively around things to the point where I can't just accept. I think in my senility, it would be nice just to walk into a supermarket and buy something without having a running critique of capitalism before I purchase it, or to be able to look at a beautiful woman and think, oh, she's a beautiful woman, without having the entire argument of sexual objectification in the 60s running through my head, versus swinging, versus if I could calm my brain and just accept the world as it is, I think I'd be a happier person.
Even if you had to trade it in for your creativity?
I think that probably would be the cost, actually. I used to wonder why I hated Henri Matisse when I was in art school. And I think it was because Matisse was happy. He could make these lovely fields of colour that had no real meaning or conflict in them at all. They were just beautiful. And I really despised the guy. But I think I would like to be a bit more like Matisse in future, you know, more calm and self-assured, and to create things that are not just about being screwed up. Funny as they are, or insightful as they are, a bit of calm in life would be lovely. And I think I'm slowly getting there.
Ewan Morrison, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And you can listen to that programme again by logging on to bbc.co.uk/Radio Scotland. Stark Talk is a Stark production for BBC Radio Scotland.